Mark M.
Okay.
Let's start with you since we know so little about you. You know, I've read sort of your basic bio, but you know, but help us understand a little bit about, you know, who you are and why you're running and what your background is a little bit. Just, you know, introduce us to you if you would. You know,
My
just
name
quickly, you know.
Okay. My name is Mark Moisier. I'm a native Californian.
Mhm.
I have had the opportunity to live in many states, but came back to California about 4.5 years ago.
Everyone always does, yeah.
It's a hard state not to come back to.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful state.
Mhm.
I guess the best way to describe it is out of high school, I got into the family business. My parents owned a chain of pizza restaurants, and so I did that for several years before working my way through law school while owning the business. Got done with law school and had an opportunity to go out to Missouri, where I was the chief of staff for a senator in Missouri, where we worked on workers' comp reform out there. That was Senate Bill 1 in 2005 in Missouri, and that was one of my projects that I was assigned to work on.
By the way, what pizza restaurant?
It was called Hometown Pizza.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. I just
No
curious. Go ahead, yeah.
And then after a couple other political opportunities, a couple other law jobs, I had an opening to come back to California, work for a firm in San Francisco, and then about 8 months later I opened up my own firm here in Walnut Creek.
And basically, what do you do?
I do general civil litigation. I'm a trial attorney. I do business litigation, I do some personal injury, and I do some employment law, both for employers and employees.
And why are you running? And what are your differences with you and the incumbent to your left, my right?
Okay, why am I running? Because I think California, I grew up hearing about how great California was. You know, the best education system, a place where businesses move to do business. That is the California I grew up hearing about, and it's not the California that I live in now. And I like to joke and say I got tired of replacing televisions because I was throwing stuff at it, but you know, the hard truth is, you know, you can be an armchair quarterback or you can get in the game, and I decided that it was time to get in the game.
And policy-wise, where are you? How would you differ from Mark D?
Okay, that's a fair question and an appropriate question.
Yeah. And I mean that policy-wise, as
Yes.
opposed to just sort of, you know, partisan platitudes.
Yeah, I understand that. There are two things that I am really running on that I see are problems with California. The first one is the pension problem, and I have been well studied on the issue of pensions, and I believe we need to make some substantial changes to the pension problems. And we saw that the problem really started in 1999 when, under good times, we reduced the retirement ages and increased the percentages, and it's bankrupting our state, it's bankrupting our cities, it's bankrupting our counties. Just this last, in the primary, East Contra Costa had that special Proposition S, if I remember right, and as a result of it not passing, 3 fire stations closed down. It is these pensions are affecting our local communities. It's affecting our police departments. It's affecting our ability to do transportation. Yes, we need to give a fair wage to our employees. We need to, take care of them, but the pensions have gotten to such a high level, an unsustainable level, that it is hurting today's generations. It's hurting today's employees. It's hurting today's taxpayers.
Obviously, you're preaching to the choir in here. What is the second issue?
Second issue is the mass exodus of jobs leaving our state. It's the state of our economy. We've heard plenty of statistics or polls, or CEO magazine says that we're the worst state in the union to do business in. We know that 2011, 4.9 corporations moved all or a majority of their jobs.
2011, I'm sorry.
2011, 4.9 corporations per week left the state of California, took jobs out of California. We know that just recently Apple is building plants in Texas to, rather than build them in California, they decided to build them in Texas. Much more job-friendly environment. And every time a corporation leaves, every time an S-Corp shuts down, when they are asked, why are you leaving? It's because of taxes and regulations. We have so regulated the business community, created so many commissions, so many regulations in the state, that businesses are finding it cheaper to do business elsewhere. And if we don't have those jobs here in California, we don't have the taxpayers, we don't have the counties and the cities are having trouble supporting the basic services that we need.
Okay, so let me ask you, what are the specific bills or policies that you would disagree with Mark D on?
Okay. Well, I'm not going to go into just line item by line item.
No, but what are, say, 3 key bills you would have disagreed with?
I'm going to first start with this. According to the California Chamber of Commerce, Mr. DeSaulnier has voted against business 87.3% of the time in his 5 years, 2 years in the Assembly, 3 years in the Senate. If you start running all the numbers, he has he votes more against business than actually the Democrat Party. There's only one senator who votes more against business, according to the California Chamber of Commerce. These are bills that are...
Okay, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but what are there specific... I'm trying to understand what specific policies that you really feel strongly where he voted one way or another and it concerns you.
I'm going to take 2 bills in particular
Okay.
that I think really demonstrate the difference in perspective between Mark DeSaulnier and myself and how we see government. The first one he introduced was recently, when MTC was building this Taj Mahal, and he introduced a bill about, the electorate or the people getting to vote for more control over MTC and ABAG.
Mm-hmm.
While it's good that there's more direct control by the people, the philosophical difference between that bill and how I see it is he's creating more government to hold government accountable rather than having our elected officials actually hold government accountable. Another bill is his recent introduction regarding the Solicitor General for the transportation. He's already the head of the Senate Committee on Transportation. He already has the ability to audit and go after a lot of the misspending by transportation. And rather than creating another government employee, another office to go handle government problems, rather than take it on himself, rather than stand up there and start holding transportation accountable, he's trying to create more government to hold it accountable. And so I think those 2 bills show the philosophical difference between Mark DeSaulnier and I. When we both believe that government should be held accountable, I believe his record shows that he would do so by more government, more commissions, more regulations, whereas I think that the legislature should hold the bureaucrats to the feet to the fire.
Okay, let's move over to you, Mark D, Senator Mark D.
How much would you like to know about me?
Well, I think we know a lot about your background. I don't think we have to go through
rich
that.
biography.
but you know, and we'll come to those couple of bills in a sec.
Mhm.
But you know, what I'd really like to get from you, first of all, is you kind of know where we've been on a lot of key issues, and frankly, on a couple of key issues, at least early on. You know, pensions, bankruptcy bill. I don't know. Do you have others that come to mind? But those are two that jump out. You know.
Oh, I'd say high-speed rail early on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You know.
That you were wrong on. So tell us why you were wrong.
Yeah.
On high-speed rail?
On all of it.
Well, I was wrong. I'm willing to admit that I'm a human being, and humans, at least as far as I know, are fallible. On all of those, let's start with bankruptcy. AB 155 by Mr. Mendoza a couple of years ago. I was a co-author. It was a spot bill. There was really no content to it. When the content got put in, I certainly started hearing not just from you folks, but local government folks. The basic problem as I saw it was you had specifically the instance of Vallejo where there was a discrepancy on what the numbers actually were. So the bargaining units, out of the 7 bargaining units, I think 2 of them didn't believe the acting city manager, the former city manager, Pleasant Hill, with his numbers. They believed he was just trying to break the contracts. Technically, it's illegal. They could take him to the Public Employees Retirement Board. But in the previous administration, it was hard to get a hearing there. So what the author wanted to do was far beyond what I was led to believe it was supposed to do. I had him take amendments, and then it died in Senate local government, who my seatmate Lois Volk held it there because she opposed it. Subsequent bill, SB 88, I authored to try to mediate the differences. And my basic purpose at that point is I became more knowledgeable about what both sides, having spent hours with both sides, that I thought, and I told you this, I think one of the times I came here, that I thought it was in everyone's best interest to get to the accurate numbers as quickly as possible. So on SB 88, we tried to negotiate, basically brought the auditor in, who's well respected by both parties. She has to come in at the back end of a bankruptcy proceeding to audit the books. My idea was to move her to the front end so that we'd make sure these differences wouldn't end up in costly litigation for everybody. That bill couldn't move because both the supporters in particular didn't like the things that I was putting in, my friends in labor. Subsequent bill was introduced by Mr. Mendoza.
So that went nowhere.
That went nowhere because we couldn't reach a resolution. Mr. Mendoza passed another bill, and the second bill was, they had to go to CDAC, but it was voluntary. Once they, it's the California Debt Infrastructure Board, which has a local government person on it, but also has the governor, the treasurer, the controller on it. The last bill we passed out of the assembly, I think on a partisan level, came over to our house, and I engaged in trying to do the same thing I tried to do.
This is the Mendoza?
The Mendoza bill.
Okay.
It made it to the Senate floor and never came out to the last day of session. It didn't have the votes to pass. But in that bill, we had moved the auditor and said you had to get the auditor to audit your books, but you didn't have to you didn't have to go to CDAC. Today, Senator Steinberg announced that he's not going to give a subsequent bill that Mr. Wachowski brought up that would add more provisions that Labor wanted to his compromise bill that passed out, the governor signed last year. Senator Steinberg said that he was going to hold it in rules because there wasn't support for it. It would have gone to Governance and Finance, which I'm on, and Senator Wolk is on, and both of us were publicly opposed to the bill. I think I learned about that. I think I tried to mediate. I spent a lot of time with both parties, and as I became more knowledgeable, I tried to work a middle ground, and there was no middle ground to be worked other than the Wachowski bill. It's currently the law that I support, and I don't support tinkering with that. We should let it play out. It's played out reasonably well in Stockton, as I understand it. On the Ma bill, again, another spot bill in the other house.
The Ma bill.
The Fiona Ma bill on pensions.
Okay, we'll come to that in a second. But,
what was the second?
But before we get off bankruptcy, why philosophically do you think that the legislature and that we needed another layer of intervention in this process?
I don't think necessarily we need another layer, but we need a third party to come in. Whether it's, you look at,
But isn't that what bankruptcy court is?
It does, but it's also expensive. So 24 other states have various levels of supervision by the state government. As I became more familiar with it, I thought the best policy would be to make sure the numbers are right, because whether it's Vernon, Hercules, Bell, we know that there's a lot of hiding of funds from a management standpoint. We also know that bargaining units, difficult bargaining units, can be obstructionists and want to stop any kind of meaningful dialogue, and unfortunately sometimes their membership thinks that management is hiding the ball all the time. So the sooner you can get to real numbers that everybody can agree on, I think the sooner you can get to whatever conclusion you need to get to, including bankruptcy if it's appropriate. The expensive part is pre-bankruptcy and in bankruptcy, when both parties are trying to hide the true numbers. So at the end of it, and I think the Wachowski bill currently, it requires them to sit down and mediate and have a chance to look at the book. So if there's a conflict, you get it out of the way before you go into bankruptcy, which you'd have to do in bankruptcy anyways, but it's less expensive, the current bill.
Okay, go to pensions.
Pensions, you know, I've said this publicly many times, and you know because you called me the day I voted for the 3%, the 2% benefit when I was on the County Board of Supervisors. We knew when it was a 4-0 vote that we had one vacancy at that time, that it was going to be a stretch, but we thought I thought that we could accomplish it. We had the issues of particularly deputy.
You're talking in 2002.
Yeah. Deputy sheriffs leaving, which is a traditional problem in this county because they don't get paid as well as Walnut Creek, Bart, and other departments, and then you have to retrain them. Particularly when in those days they used to get vested in 5 years, they'd rotate out of the jail after 4 years, and then they'd have to rotate back in oftentimes 4 years later, and that's when we were losing people. In hindsight, it was clearly a mistake. The investment returns, I think David Crane's numbers, and I agree with them on this, you would have to have the equivalent volume on the New York Stock Exchange of about 17,000, and you'd have to have the same kind of results on your real estate investments. Clearly that hasn't materialized. As I've told both of you, I think, and I've been on public record about it, the value of hindsight, I wouldn't have voted for it. Our current benefit package for current employees, particularly employees who were vested under the old rules, is unsustainable, and having chaired 2 budget subcommittees, particularly the last 2 years in Health and Human Services, where we've had to cut almost $7 billion to the social safety net. That's a hard vote for a Democrat who's progressive to take versus the challenge of trying to support unions and public unions. So at this point, I support most of what the governor is asking for. I think that employees...
Well, we skipped over something. Well, let's
You
come
want
to
to
the
go back to the
governor's
Ma bill?
Yeah, let's go to the Ma bill. And
The Ma bill?
how did you get on board originally with the Ma bill? I mean,
I was too aggressive when I was in the Assembly about supporting Democratic bills. I wanted to demonstrate that I was a team player. The legislature, I found over time that to be effective, you have to be, especially part of the majority party, you need to be supportive of both your colleagues and your constituent groups, and I am a progressive. I was when I was a Republican. I am as a Democrat. As both of you know, I think I've been supported by labor every time I've run, including when I ran as a Republican for nonpartisan office. Having said that, I co-authored too many bills. If you look at our recent history, I don't do as many, so I've learned in that regard as well. The Ma bill was brought to me when it was in the House of Origin as an attempt by labor to offer suggestions that would get to the unsustainability of the pension system in 37 Act counties. At the same time, Senator Simitian in our House was going through a process introducing a bill when it comes to CalPERS and state agencies, state employees. As I started to engage, just like on the bankruptcy bill, I started to learn more. Some of that came from both of you and what you wrote and discussions I had with you. I engaged with the attorney on your recommendation, Dan Weinstein, of the Cicero attorney. I met with Mr. Paul Scheck, the county treasurer, and as I engaged and spent hundreds of hours with people on both sides, I discovered that there clearly were abuses in the system, that the spiking and the airtime were things that need to be corrected. that uniform allowances, in the case of the Moraga Linda chief, where car allowances were benched so that I think it was a $7,000 ongoing benefit to that individual. There clearly were abuses. It's not just unsustainable. Many of them were unethical. So as we went through that process, we got the bill amended many times in the Senate, much to the consternation of a lot of people. I was more engaged than a member would normally be engaged in another person's bill that wasn't coming in front of a committee that I was a member of. But because Contra Costa and Fresno are the two 37 Act counties who have the biggest problems, I thought it was appropriate. We got enough amendments that the last day, you actually editorialized supporting the bill when it went to the floor. It passed out of the floor, and Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed it. His veto message, as I remember, was that there needed to be more comprehensive pension reform. So I put a lot of time into both of those things. I'm on the record as saying on both instances I was wrong to begin with when I engaged in them, which I think both of you know that when issues are difficult, I engage at a fairly significant level. As I learned more, I changed my position.
What was the third one?
Pensions in general, or are you going to talk about high-speed rail?
High-speed rail.
High-speed rail, I still am a believer of, as high-speed rail is one of the four components in a mature passenger rail system. I think when you look out at California as it builds out over the next 30, 35 years, we're going to add the equivalent of the state of New York, another 16 million people. That's the same number of people we added in the last 35 years. We clearly are going to become more urbanized. We're looking at $8 to $10 a gallon gasoline, according to the Energy Commission and others. You have to give commuters options, and passenger rail is part of that. High-speed rail is one of the four components. The three other components are traditional urban rail and transit, like Muni, the subway systems, AC transit. Then there's commuter rail, which in our case is BART. In LA, it's Metro, Metrolink. And then there's conventional intercity rail, which is the Amtrak line. And lastly, there's high-speed rail. High-speed rail is the most expensive and least necessary of those four components. If you look at other industrialized countries that have a mature passenger rail culture and system, they started where the ridership was and the need was. They attracted private sector money, both operationally and from a capital standpoint. You don't start with the highest cost, the least need, in the place where it's most stranded, which is what the proposal from the High-Speed Rail Authority was that was in front of us. So while I have a bill that would require the California Transportation Commission to work with Caltrans and high-speed rail, and it has a number of specific requirements in terms of ridership, revenue, energy use, that I think would change that. But high-speed rail is is one of the biggest mistakes I think the state's ever done. And one of the things it's done for us, for the Democrats, is we constantly complain about being boxed in on the formulas on our budget, whether it's through the initiative system, through direct financing, or things like three strikes. High-speed rail will do the same thing. So the debt service on the full $10 billion when we appropriate, if we appropriate it all, will be about $800 million a year. That debt service has got to come out of somewhere. It'll come out of Health and Human Services, most likely. And it won't give Californians that actually need investments in congestion relief and dependency on high-cost transportation needs, it won't give them any value. So last week I proposed 6 projects, all that were shovel-ready. They were CEQA-entitled. They're all part of the overall high-speed rail project, which is part of the mature passenger rail system. They could have got people to work quickly, and they would have given immediate expediency and result to commuters within the next 2 or 3 years.
So let's go to the issues that Mark M raises. The MTC bill and the Solicitor General for Transportation.
Okay, I'll start with the second one first. It's not Solicitor General, it's Inspector General. It actually started with a conversation I had with somebody when I was visiting Lawrence Livermore, who used to work for the New York Inspector General. And he said, he's a scientist and he worked for them and he was an investigator and a numbers person. He said he couldn't believe California didn't have an office like this, that New York had saved a lot of money in corruption and provided a third party that was separated from the administration, the governor, and the legislature with expertise that would come in and actually provide a third party analysis. It's been particularly effective, and the federal government has inspector generals in transportation and other areas. It's been particularly effective with whistleblowers. If you go to their website, we talk to them in New York, they've been very good about separating whistleblowers who are calling to complain versus whistleblowers who are individual employees who have specific things that need to be investigated, and it needs to be investigated separate. In both of the instances that Mark brought up, with all due respect, it's not new money. Our bill would, as it currently is, would have the California Transportation Commission study it, look at other jurisdictions, and then identify the funding within their existing budget. There's hundreds of vacancies right now in Caltrans. I would like them to fill 10 or 15 positions, fairly small budget for the Inspector General's office. Hopefully by 2014, so we'll let CTTC send some money, some time on it to get it right. And it would, those positions would be filled prior to other positions being filled. There's a lot of redundancies currently in Caltrans in terms of them, in my view, and other people look at it, them doing too much oversight of highways and transportation projects. So, and then on MTC, both of you know I have a long history, having served on 3 of the 5 regional agencies. I don't think they work particularly well. I think they're insular, they're not responsive to the general public. They've become more and more important. When they were founded and statutorily created in the 60s and the 70s, we had a completely different social model, and vehicle miles traveled were completely different. Career mobility was different. You had one-income households living in one city and not having traditional commutes, but they weren't particularly long. Now you've got people graduating from high school this year. The Labor Department says they'll have to change careers 6 times. They move a lot, and the regional agencies, because of that, people live more regionally. They're more important, but they're too insular. MTC, I think, has way too much control and authority over transportation funds. The RTP is over $100 billion right now. And I think there's not very good accountability either to the commissioners or the general public as to how that money is spent, and particularly on objective performance standards. In this instance, what the Bay Area Regional Commission would have done would have taken the place of an existing body of appointed people, the Joint Planning Committee, that actually started from a bill that Senator Torlakson did when he and I tried to merge ABAG and MTC, and this was a compromise. It would remove them and place a directly elected 15-member board. Because having been in Metro Portland, I think that's the only way to get people to be more responsive. If they have to face the voters every 4 years, they're going to be more responsive and they're going to act more regionally. So in both instances, I agree with Mark. You don't want to add another layer of government. You want to make it more efficient and effective. What I'm trying to do is add more accountability and use existing funds. Otherwise, it wouldn't get out of our Appropriations Committee anyways. Our threshold is $50,000 in new revenue in any bill, then it doesn't get out of the committee.
So you want to take that back and respond and give us your thoughts on
just the last 2 or the whole thing? Or
if you want to go through the whole thing, you know, I mean, but just take it pretty directly. Okay? Yeah. I mean, we need to hear from him specifically why he did what he did.
Yes.
Because we have an incumbent here. But I want to give you an opportunity to sort of, you know, weigh in on your observations on it. You know, to give us a sense of how you would function and where you would be on some of these things. You know, if you want to take them, they were pensions, they were bankruptcy, they were high-speed rail, and then your 2 bills.
Okay.
Yeah. But you know, tick down. Yeah.
Yeah. Mark DeSagne has a lot more experience when it comes to transportation than mine because he sits on the committee, and I will not be able to go to the level of detail that he has been able to do. But he still supports the concept of the high-speed rail. Right now, Our problem is not getting people from LA to San Francisco or San Francisco to LA. Our problem is right here and just getting into San Francisco or just driving from Walnut Creek down to the Tri-Valley area. In LA, they're not having trouble getting up to San Francisco, they're having trouble just getting across town. These metropolitan areas are not keeping up with what we need. And rather than spending money or even considering spending money on trying to get people from long distances, we got to spend our transportation dollars locally. We got to take care of the local issue. And so that's where, you know, I don't even, in my realm of thinking, the bullet train from here to LA is such a low priority compared to all the immediate problems that we have just with the concept of the Bay Bridge that's taken us 20 plus years to build, that's no wider, and people can be stuck in traffic 2 hours just getting across the bridge. There's enough problems locally, transportation-wise, that we need to start focusing on local problems and taking care of the local stuff. On pensions, 1999, state expanded pensions. 2002, county expanded because everybody followed the state's lead. The state needs to make some changes. The counties are going to be following suit. But it's not enough just to make changes on future employees. We're going to have to get in there and do a constitutional amendment so that way we can change the benefits of current employees' future benefits. The benefits that they've earned, they're entitled to, but the problem is the people who are currently employees are the employees who are going to be collecting pension benefits the soonest.
Do you agree with that, by the way?
Well, you and I have talked about this. It's the contract clause of the U.S. Constitution and whether you can go back retroactively and eliminate a contract. There was a case in Orange County last year that said you couldn't.
Well, that's not exactly what the Orange County case is. That's good. Go ahead, Dan.
But it's a problem. You and I have talked about it. I mean, in a way, I'm sorry to you reference.
No. You know, he raises it. You know,
no.
From my perspective, a good point on it.
There's multiple ways you can deal with existing employees. I'm carrying a bill for the county right now because they bargained it. Where for new hires, it'll all go to the public safety will go to 3% 55. Regulars, it's back to 60. In addition to that, they've all taken roughly about 5% pay cuts. So you can deal with existing employees under the current negotiations by cutting back on their wages. If we can find a legal way that can deal with the unsustainability of current employees other than negotiations, I'm all ears.
So if you're saying for current employees prospectively, you're all ears if there's a legal way to do it.
Mm-hmm. My preference is to work through negotiations, I think, but we have to have really hard negotiations. We're supposed to do that in the next month in the legislature.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. The way how California Constitution has been interpreted, many other states have interpreted the Constitution to allow them to change unearned benefits regarding pensions, but California courts do not seem to allow that, and that's why I think we need to make it some kind of California constitutional amendment that the legislature needs to put forth so that we have that tool to negotiate. I mean, I negotiate as a part of my business all the time. As long as that tool is not in the chest, it's going to really seriously hamper the state, the counties, and the cities from even negotiating us out of this. Because if we don't solve this problem, we're going to run the state into bankruptcy. I've heard numbers as high as 800 billion. I've heard, 400 billion seems to be the conservative number of what the state has on unfunded pension liability. It's a lot.
I don't know what it is, but it seems to be the GOP candidates want to use this $800 and some billion figure. I have no idea where it comes from.
I'm willing to keep
previous candidates
fortified.
cited Stanford And I don't see that in the Stanford numbers. That said, it's huge. It's a huge number,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's the right number.
400 seems to be the conservative number that I've heard. 500 seems to be the popular. Maybe it's because it's so round or whatever. But 400, 500 billion, divide that out by 30 years, is more than the pension short, or more than the deficit shortfall that we were dealing with just this year. We got a major problem that we got to deal with, and we got to deal with now before we start seeing our counties go bankrupt, or even our state go bankrupt. And that's the last thing I want to see have happen, is because if we go bankrupt, all the pensions that these people have is going to be up in the air as to what they're going to get. It's better to make the changes now where everybody knows what they get. It's one of the things that we deal with in settlement of cases. It's better to know what you're going to get than to go into court and have somebody tell you what you're going to get. And that's what happens when we go into bankruptcy. A judge is going to say, this is what you get, this is what you don't get. It's better if we can get to the table. Let's make sure we have the tools at the table so that way we can deal with it. I'm glad that the legislature is going to be doing some negotiation. The problem I have is that so much union money has been put into those people's election campaign that is it going to be the tough negotiations that it needs to be? Is it going to be an impartial negotiation?
Well, you mentioned bankruptcy. What about the municipal bankruptcy notion?
Where they have to go to the auditor for 90 days first. Is that what you're?
Yeah. Well, and the bills that Mark D. supported now says were a mistake in retrospect.
The bankruptcy process is there. I do hear and I understand the concern that was raised about how expensive courts can be and how expensive the process can be. The problem is if the city council, that's what they're responsible for, and if that's the choice that they have to make, delaying the process is not helping the process.
Okay. Are we skipping anything here?
We talked transportation, pension, and the first issue was.
And then he responded to your issues.
Yeah, and then
which I think we probably.
And I think we've kind of discussed it, unless there's something that somebody has a specific question.
Well, if I could, just one thing, maybe it'll get into how we finance campaigns is a big problem in Mark. Democrats get their money largely from public labor unions. There's a controversial attempt, 32, that will change that on the initiative process. I historically have felt there needs to be a balance between labor and capital. So Republicans, with all due respect, they get their fundraising from a particular constituency as well. So that, a lot of people will also, I think it's not unfair to say, and this is not to defend the decisions that I and others made on public employees' pensions, but everybody got a little greedy on what they expected in terms of what they were going to get in investments, including in the media market, where there are a lot of leverage buyouts. And that world doesn't exist anymore. So one of the things that frustrates me, and I have a very good relationship with my colleagues in the Republican Party, and most of my most important successful bills have been bipartisanly supported, is the big issue in this country, and you can see it in the presidential campaign, you can see it all through this country, is the cost of getting elected and who we are beholden to because of that.
We're still slogging through Prop 32. Where are you both at on it?
Well, I oppose it.
I am supporting it as, I think, a step in the right direction.
Right.
Tell us about in the last week, we've had or a couple of weeks, had the governor's latest idea about the Delta. That affects this district dramatically. Why don't you tell us your positions on the governor, specifically what the governor has brought up? Now, we could go into a John DeVito rant that goes on for 6 hours on the Delta, but just specifically on what the governor has to say.
Well, for me, I opposed it as soon as he announced it. Lois Wolk and I wrote an opinion piece. We did a press release together. Lois and I represent the Delta in the Senate, the two of us. She represents 4 of the 5 counties. I represent Contra Costa. In terms of this particular initiative by the governor, like I did in an article in this paper today, to very much like high-speed rail, we're getting committed without knowing the consequences. So doing revenue bonds when LA Metro says that they're going to have the users pay for the capital construction of these, and then San Diego Water comes out and says, wait a minute, nobody's told us about this. So I don't think it's near completed, and how that interacts with the BDCP and with the previous $13 billion worth of general obligation bonds that I voted against, and was in a difficult discussion with leadership because I was very strongly against it, and it just barely passed out. So that's $26 billion of revenue and general bond obligations. The general bond obligations we just passed on for another 2 years because it was supposed to be up 2 years ago, and then this year that Governor Schwarzenegger negotiated with the Democratic leadership. I think we should go back to the start. We can make water usage much more efficient. The analogies we usually brought to what California's done in terms of energy consumption in the last 30 years, and particularly when it comes to the ag industry. In my view, it's not a north-south battle anymore as much as it's an east-west battle. And we can be much more efficient. We can do storage. We've done storage at Los Vaqueros. We can do it again. Environmental community supported that. But putting a conveyance above the delta is a recipe for disaster on multiple levels. And the most important thing is, as Mr. Brainerd's article said today, is Governor Schwarzenegger said the most important investment we could make almost in anything was retrofitting or rebuilding the levees. We still haven't done that, and it's just a matter of time before they fail. So we should be doing that, making sure we protect the delta and make sure we're much more efficient in how we use water, and starting to try to control as legally we can water rights that historically have been given to people who are middlemen who make billions of dollars off of it over years.
Real simple. I oppose.
Okay. No need for a lot of debate on that one.
You guys want to give us just like a 1 minute sort of wrap up on a summation? You start with you, Mark, since
Okay.
you're Mark D.
Well, I've chaired 5 committees in the legislature, 3 policy committees in the time I've been there, 2 fiscal subcommittees. I've chaired 7 select committees, 1 joint policy committee, 2 task force. I'm a independent, I think, but team player of the Democratic majority. I've been able to very aggressively, always held lots of public outreach. We have.
Can I stop you for a second? What does that mean? An independent but a team player of the Democratic majority.
I think you've got to in a.
Those seem to be contradictory.
Sometimes they are,
Yeah.
and you have to choose your moments. To tell you the truth, I mean, you have a 2-party system. I'm a member of the majority. As we have seen, there are people who can be very independent and ineffective. The trick is, I think, to be principled and hardworking and knowledgeable, at least for me in my journey through this. Be part of the team, which is first the Democratic Majority Party, but also try to work with my colleagues because they're Californians and Americans first, and it's too bad that we get stuck in these ideological ruts. But as a part of any working group in any employment situation, you have to work with your colleagues. And sometimes you disagree, but if you're a complete jerk about it, you don't work well with others, and generally you don't get a lot done. So there's some balance in there.
So does that mean you go to the Bay Bridge series and wear one of those goofy double hats?
No, I've become not being a native of California and a native of Massachusetts, I'm still a Red Sox fan. But I've become a
My condolences. There's
That could kill your whole
there's
political
medicine
career
for that, you know,
yeah, but none of it is very satisfying.
or very effective.
So just finally, I mean, I think, I've worked hard, I've tried to be thoughtful. I've been responsive to you folks, I've been responsive to the general public. I meet with people I disagree with frequently, and lots of times they're right, and I correct myself when I'm wrong. Having said that, I feel very strongly about the balances in this country between individual hard work and merit and fair play and a set of community values that allows people to do well in this country. And I think that's, you know, since Jefferson and Hamilton, it will continue to be. And Mark dresses up as James Madison, who I'm a fan of. I think that's just part of the historical tension in this country, is in trying to get a balance. It's not a destination, it's a struggle that we always have, and unfortunately we seem to be far apart right now.
I will start with the comment of dressing up as James Madison. He is one of my heroes. I have actually a first edition set of the Madison papers sitting in my house, and I have read them. I understand the fundamental principles of how this country and how this state were established, and it is a government that's supposed to be limited. Back in the 60s and 70s, California had arguably one of the best educational systems in the world. It had one of the best business climates in the world. And over the last 40 years, we have seen a trampling of our status in the world when it comes to both education and business. And there's a couple things that we can look at. One is the excessive regulations that have been put upon education. I mean, the number of administrators that we now have compared to what we had in the 70s is astronomical. I've talked to teachers and administrators, and they constantly are telling me that they wish Sacramento would leave them alone and allow them to actually do what they are trained to do, and that is teach, rather than have Sacramento just pile on all these regulations of what they're supposed to do. And it's a problem. Our education system is dropping. We're spending money on administration, and it's coming from Sacramento, and it's coming from this top down. It's coming from Washington, D.C., this top down perspective. And as a lover of our history, lover of, you know, what made California great, it's that independence. It's that, you know, smaller government from bottom up, and that is the philosophical difference, I think, between Desanya and I, is that I believe in a real limited government, and we need to, there has to be some rules. You know, a teenager living in his parents' house has some rules, but the older they get, the more freedoms they get, the more liberties they have. And I believe in California we have been strangling the liberties and freedoms of businesses to the point where they are driving them out of the state, so that where they find it's cheaper to do business elsewhere.